A lot of people, when they look at something that's made in China, they will naturally think that it's low quality, cheap, not very durable. And that might have been true.
In this video, the supply chain expert is going to answer some questions about Temu, which is an online marketplace that is based in China. And he will also explain how ideal China is in terms of manufacturing and many other things about supply chain and how China is at the center of it all. So let's continue.
I'm Aaron Allpeter. I'm a supply chain expert who helps founders start, scale, and exit their businesses. Let's answer your questions from the internet. This is Chinese manufacturing support. DL Vermeer asked, how is Temu so cheap? Me trying to figure out how Temu can afford a commercial every break when my cart of 104,564 items costs 90 cents. Answer, your information is more valuable than the items. It used to be for the longest time that China and Chinese factories would produce everything, but the brands were Western. People wanted something that denoted quality, something that was familiar to them. And so even though it may be completely produced in China, if it had Nike or Adidas or something like that, you felt better about it. What Temu's done is it's not really a marketplace. It's actually a demand aggregation platform. Think about this. They're going to these factories and saying, hey, we want to make sure that your manufacturing lines are running. And so what they do is they go out and they acquire customers and they have gamification where they're able to basically sell that excess capacity. And so the key thing is, if I was going to lose money anyways by keeping my factory idle, if I could make $1 by selling a widget, I'm going to do that all day, every day. And if you look at Temu, you'll see that what they offer changes from time to time. This is those factories with excess capacity saying, hey, I can make a car charger, or I can make some gloves, and just saying I have this amount that's available. And then Temu goes through and prices it accordingly to make sure that they're able to move that inventory. And Temu is a fascinating case study in just how a modern Chinese-first brand has really locked on to the Western consumer to solve a capacity issue that China would have had if they had only been reliant on Western brands. And so when I'm buying a pair of gloves for 90 cents, the likelihood that that factory had the best labor laws, the best outputs, the best sustainability capabilities is probably not 100%. The other part is that this factory ecosystem is extremely competitive. And you look at Shein as another one that has just built this ecosystem where these factories are constantly vying for demand and volume and things like that because they operate on razor-thin margins. And so the name of the game is to make sure that they are pushing product out. As soon as the product stops going out, then they run into an issue where they're underwater, they're losing money. And so they will do next to anything just to make sure that their factories can running, that they can stay afloat. Dank Doobies 420 asked, if everything you own that was made in China suddenly vanished, what would you have left? I would break things into 3 buckets. There is one bucket of things that would still come from China that we wouldn't be able to get access to. This would be things like consumer electronics. So I'm not talking about just cell phones, but chargers, cables. Those things, you'd be unable to get them because there is so much density and capital efficiency that goes into producing them at scale that you can't just pick up that factory because it's a whole ecosystem of manufacturers that's missing. The second bucket, which would be the biggest bucket, they may not be completely produced in China, but they have significant subcomponents and raw materials that come from there. So a good example would be apparel and footwear. Even though Vietnam, India, Bangladesh produce a lot of apparel products, these sorts of things are dependent on a Chinese supply chain. And so you might expect these to be 80 to 100% more expensive if we didn't have Chinese support. And lastly, there are some things that the US can produce and would be fine with. And these are going to be things like defense, aerospace, weapons, things that are highly automated that you could literally pick up the machine and move over because it doesn't require a whole lot of labor and it's fairly strategic. Sam Datatola1 said, so that's why I can't tell the difference between a good Chinese knockoff and the real deal. They come from the same place. A lot of people, when they look at something that's made in China, they will naturally think that it's low quality, cheap, not very durable. And that might have been true. And that may be true for some categories even today. But as they have moved up the quality ecosystem, a lot of products coming from China are fantastic. And this is why a lot of big brands only source from China. You know, naturally when I see that something comes from France or Italy, I'm just assuming that it's better. And that is a psychology thing, that's a branding thing. I think earlier in 2025, when the trade war first heated up, there was this big push toward Chinese factories in particular exposing the luxury suppliers that they were supporting.
They take almost finished bags from China factories and just do the repackaging and logo installing.
That was kind of a conscious effort that a lot of trade associations said, say, hey, if you're going to put tariffs on us, then we're going to go after and puncture this veil that you have of Chinese goods being so low quality, and basically showing, hey, I've got something that is 95% of the way done. Yeah, they may put the label on in QA, but it's pretty good. And so I think it was part of the geopolitical tool bag that China had to try to show that the West needed China, but it was also a way that they could show that they had higher quality capabilities than what most people thought. I think that had the trade war not started, then they probably would have kept that secret a little bit longer, but this was the opportunity they were waiting for to show the world that they could make really high quality stuff. Abun GM1 asked, why do you think Chinese government banned NVIDIA, Intel, and chips now in China? The reality is that China wants these chips, and it was the US that put the export controls on there saying, hey, we're not going to let you have these top-of-the-line pieces. A lot of this is geopolitical. A real concern that if China were to win in AI, that would probably be the death nail in terms of American hegemony. And so by restricting these top-of-the-line chips, what we were trying to do was to give US companies a couple-year head start. And what it's done is kind of a bit of a backfire where China's still going to innovate. They're going to still be investing in AI, and they are now pushing their own companies to develop something because their AI companies don't have NVIDIA as an option. And so the best thing that the US could have done actually is to continue to sell NVIDIA or Intel chips, but maybe keep them a model or two below the cutting edge piece to keep the lock-in so that these companies would still build and be dependent on these US designed chips. Whereas now we've kind of created the situation where in a couple of years, China will have chips that are probably as good as NVIDIA's chips, if not beginning to compete or outcompete them. Agent of Faris asked, how is damn near everything made in China? When you go to China, you've got certain cities that are known for electronics, certain cities that are known for apparel, certain cities that are known for zippers. This is because of the way that China built and nurtured these ecosystems. When companies came to Shenzhen, which was a fishing village 40 years ago, which is now, I think, the fastest growing city on the planet, it is known for consumer electronics. This is because they initially invited a company in, Apple, among others, who decided that they were going to partner with a local contract manufacturer who's going to assemble their products. And then because they needed all these other suppliers and start making these other things, that network was built. So China's able to make everything because they have a very tight interconnected ecosystems. It's kind of like if you were going shopping and let's suppose you're having a dinner party and you want to serve pizza. You could go to the butcher, you could go to the bakery, you could go to the farmer's market, or you could go to a supermarket that has all of those things. China is kind of like the supermarket for these different things. That's why, there's no place like China. We worked with a lot of companies that when the tariffs first were announced, they said, hey, I need to be ABC anywhere but China. And so we worked with them and tried to find folks in Mexico, Vietnam, Indonesia, and we were able to relocate a lot of them. But a lot of these companies are now coming back to China because they recognize that it's not just about the person who's doing the final assembly. It's about all of the suppliers and having options and being able to iterate quickly. So it is this entire ecosystem of people, products, machinery, regulations that allow them to be very diverse in the areas that they want to be at. A Quora user asked, which countries, if any, are close to being able to compete with China in terms of manufacturing costs and quality? It really depends on which industry you're looking at. The US is looking to invest heavily into defense-related industries, semiconductors, those sorts of things. So when I say semiconductor, I'm really talking about all of the chips that go into every product that we have that has an electronic pulse today. There are some cutting-edge chips, like you'd see AI chips that can do AI models, but really the majority of the chips are things that power your toaster, your oven, things like that. The CHIPS Act, which was announced in the Biden administration, was about a $55 billion investment. That is a good first step. However, China has had $50 billion invested by Western companies each year for the last 20 years. I think that when it comes to competing with China, we have to be very clear about where a country wants to compete. I don't think the intention here is to become the number one exporter of cell phone cables. But the reality is that there are certain things that when you look at them from a geopolitical lens, you want to be able to do it. And then from there, they need to put the industrial policy in place. This means being a guaranteed buyer of some capacity. It means making it very easy for these factories to be built, for the regulations to be curtailed, so that you're still protecting the environment, but making it so that you're only going through one environmental review versus 6. China endured 20 to 25 years of pain in terms of low margin, lots of investment before they got to a point where they are now. And so any country that's going to look to do that has to be willing to go through a similar level of pain, because it isn't as simple as placing an order on Amazon and having a new industry. The reason that Taiwan is such a hotbed is there is one company, TSMC, that has become the world's semiconductor manufacturing floor. They're the only ones capable of producing the cutting-edge AI chips that are out there. China would love to have that inside of their manufacturing base because that gives them another geopolitical lever. The US wants to make sure that it is outside of China's orbit for that exact same reason. And so all of this effort of trying to move factories and fabrications into other countries is because these countries recognize that perhaps the world is not going to be as globalized and as stable as it has been the last 40 or 60 years. And so there's an effort to moving that capacity over. And interesting enough, one of the best sources of defense that Taiwan has is that they have said that they've got explosive stuff around those factories, and so if they are ever invaded, they'll just blow the factory up. And so that's one of those key things that would really put the whole world economy back by decades, because we're literally inventing things and using things in the future that we can only make in one place. Ancient Lettuce 6821 asked, anyone wonder how come China can pump out so many new EV car brands? It's really more about the ecosystem that they've built. So they became experts at building these reliable batteries at scale and at a low cost. Once they've done that, they've also invested an enormous amount in steel and energy, and they basically spent 20 to 30 years putting all the raw ingredients together. And then you get to a point where you've got Western automakers that come into China because they are tempted by the enormous population. Tesla quickly found that China was their number one market, and they began to build their gigafactory. But the big thing they had to build was the network of suppliers, because they didn't have the people that could build the chassis or the batteries or things like that. And so the first thing that Tesla had to do wasn't build a factory, but was to qualify and teach the vendors. And because you don't want to be locked into any one vendor, you're going to teach several vendors, and you're going to trade, and you're going to go back and forth, and you're going to try to negotiate. And so as you have this proliferation of vendors who know how to make things for Tesla, well, it becomes very easy to make something for insert car company here. And so they basically have this ecosystem where the West has taught them what they need, what they care about, what the quality standards look like, and now they have enormous capacity and labor and know-how to go out and do these things. BYD is the largest EV manufacturer. People didn't know what BYD was 5 years ago. And so this does feel like a sudden dramatic rise, but it's something that's been intentional and really highlights where the Chinese government said, we want to be good at EVs. We're going to orchestrate the finances. We're going to make all the loans. We're going to clear away all the permits and regulatory so that we can build literally factories the sizes of cities to start producing these cars. Happy Giraffe Tim asked, how hilariously draconian is your working contract in China? So this is one where I think that China's gotten a bad rap. When there were issues with worker safety, the result was to put nets at the bottom of the factory so people couldn't jump from their windows, as opposed to trying to fix those conditions. You had tens of millions of people who would move from the rural countryside into the cities each year and take some money home for their families. And so when there was a large cohort of people who were willing to do this work, it was somewhat easier to find someone that would do something maybe they didn't want to do. As there have become less people available for this work, they've actually had to go out and recruit people. And so you're starting to see these working conditions improve on their own pretty quickly. Lindsay52384781 asked, why does China manufacture some of our medication? The interesting thing about the pharmaceutical industry is that it is global by nature. And really what China produces is a lot of the what's called APIs. Think of these as the raw ingredients. These are things that are very difficult to produce from a chemical perspective, and they typically have a very low margin. When it comes to how we got here, there were a few things that happened. The first one was a lot of environmental regulation in the US really made it so it was more expensive and difficult to do these sorts of things. And that was because these APIs are very dirty. There's a lot of wastewater that's produced. And so as you look at this and say, okay, can we externalize some of these environmental costs? People started to look elsewhere. The other part is that we fell in love with generic drugs. And so if we are seeing this constant pressure of generic drugs, then we have to find lower inputs for these ingredients. And the third part was there's an enormous amount of capacity has to go into building these factories. And so one of the things that China has done is take a very long view at manufacturing. And so in the US, if I wanted to build a factory, I'd probably have to put a business plan together. I go to a bank. And as long as I have a consumer and I have a market there, I'll probably get financing for that. China took a different approach. And they said, look, if we know that the capacity is going to be there, let's just build it and we'll figure out the customers later. And so they were willing to build these massive factories that had this massive amount of scale that were able to push the cost down lower and lower. And they made the bet that if they did so, that everyone else who was looking for these cheap inputs would be flocking to these mega factories. And that structural advantage would be a lock-in for them. And so they're not making the final pill, but a lot of the raw ingredients, and that's why we have lower cost prescription drugs than we would have otherwise. I think that the investment that they've done in pharmaceutical manufacturing and medical device manufacturing in general really illustrates what they've done well from a long-term perspective here. So they started out by doing the things that nobody else wanted to do, the things that were low margin, low cost, high volume. What they ended up doing is they had Western companies come in and show them about their quality standards and basically upskill the labor force. And one of the smart things that they would do is they would have someone who came in from a big company and they would train 10 or 15 workers on how to do the quality spec. And the next time that person came, there'd be 10 to 15 new people. They intentionally rotated them out because they saw that for a period of 15 to 20 years, they would get free education. Then the next thing that they would do is these Western companies would work with these Chinese factories to identify those cutting edge things. The epicenter of innovation really moved to where the factories are in China. And so now you look forward, and not only do you have the manufacturing base, not only do you have the skills that are there, but you now have a cohort of people who are used to being the leading edge of the innovation cycle for the world. FPUN asks, is it true that Chinese people try to avoid Chinese products? I think that that's starting to change. For the longest time, it used to be that Western brands meant quality. I mean, you look at Apple cell phones. This was something where people would stand in lines for days in order to get their hands on the cell phone because of what it meant. That started to change, where now Huawei or Xiaomi is like the #1 cell phone in China, because as relations between the West and China have soured, people are taking that on the brands. They're saying, you know what? Well, I want to support a local team, right? And so that's what they're doing. There's a post in the Tools subreddit. Is made in USA still synonymous with quality and durability, or is it nothing more than a marketing gimmick nowadays? As the perception of China has matured, and we actually see that you can get high quality, high cost things from China, the juxtaposition between US and China has changed. There are some products that made in the USA actually does mean better or more durable. We used to make a lot of furniture. North Carolina was the furniture capital of the world. Most of those jobs and most of that know-how and infrastructure has moved overseas. And so even if we wanted to have handmade, made in America type furniture, the volume of suppliers that you have available is very, very small. And so if you were to compare that, 1 or 2 factories that can produce a dresser in North Carolina are on average better than the 1,000 suppliers in China that can produce a dresser, but they're playing in different spaces. And so I think that that's an important piece to look at. As you look at electric cars, this is one where the auto industry is pretty scared because BYD makes a really good car. And this is why the US has put on tariffs of literally over 100% in order to keep these electric vehicles out of the US market. I mean, there's lots of reasons for doing that. The auto industry has an enormous amount of jobs and economic output that's tied to it. And so we're trying to protect that industry. There's also some military capabilities. If you remember in World War II, we turned all of those automobile factories into making planes and Jeeps and things like that. And so there's a national security element here for why you want to keep those low-cost, better EVs out of the market. But, I think it's not far away before BYD builds a factory in Georgia or in Alabama. And now we have that U.S. manufacturing base, and you start to see a lot of those high-quality, lower-cost cars coming into the U.S. market. Ravenhawk10 asked, as Beijing's Made in China 2025 plan nears the finish line, how well has it done? So Made in China 2025 was a policy that was launched by Xi Jinping in 2015, and the whole focus was on making the Chinese economy and supply chain more resilient and robust and not being as dependent on outside technology or capabilities. China had become a powerful country, but it had become very fragile. They were very dependent on key sources of technology. They were reliant on chips that were designed in the United States and produced by machines from the Netherlands. Their entire ecosystem for consumer electronics, cars, etc., was based off these chips. And so what China 2025 has been is an effort to identify these bottlenecks and to get through them. And so that's why you see enormous amounts of dollars going into chip manufacturing and building domestic supply bases. That's why you see an enormous amount of effort going into solar and battery and energy in general, rare earths, where they have an enormous percentage of the refining capacity of rare earths. They've gone from being susceptible to bottlenecks to now using that as a piece of geopolitical influence. Jude Loa said, so long to 9 to 5, hello 996. So 9 to 5 is the typical work week that we're used to in the United States. 996 stands for 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week. This has been something that has been a common moniker in China for a long time. And what you're seeing now is that in a global economy where we all got very comfortable with Zoom and remote teams, you're now competing globally. And so if I am a AI startup, if I'm a consumer product company, and I am competing with somebody who is equally as talented as I am, but they're willing to work a lot more than I am, then that company is probably going to beat me. This comment is really about how 996 is percolating into Silicon Valley and other startups. The way that China has managed their companies is they basically put a bunch of demand out there and say, we're going to buy a lot of solar panels. We're going to buy a lot of cars. And there are an enormous amount of companies that are going out and fighting to see which one's going to win. And after they see a natural winner that appears, then they will pluck them out and say, okay, this is now our national champion, and we're going to lean in and make this our export hub for the world. When it comes to this 996 mentality, this is because these companies recognize that there is a great opportunity here. If they can be that company that can outcompete the others and be identified as the national hero, then they're going to be able to build all that wealth. Billy Can 1776 asked, does China ever get fined for making or selling products that blatantly break copyright and patent laws? When it comes to IP and copyright infringement, some of the things that have happened over the years were very systematic. And so, one of the most commonly pointed to things is that if you wanted to manufacture in China, for the longest time, you had to have a joint venture with a local Chinese company. That meant that if I wanted to make computers or cell phones, I had to share all of my secrets, all of my know-how, all of my specs, my quality standards with that partner. By doing that, you're able to produce your products, but you're starting to teach other people. It was an intentional plan by the Communist Party to find the industries that they cared the most about, bring in these Western companies and learn what they were doing, how they were doing it, and then go from there. And so, there are lawsuits that happen when it's clear that, there was corporate espionage and things like that. But in general, this is a big issue, not because China is spying and stealing stuff, but because Western companies have been so willing to give them those trade secrets and then complain when things look very, very similar. Lemon80 asks, dark factories, entire facilities now run 24/7 with 0 humans, and nobody's talking about it. So let's start by defining a dark factory. The idea here is that you've got a factory that's making something with very little human involvement. It's mainly going to be run by machines, robots, AI, where you're able to place an order and things start to be produced. This is definitely happening. It's happening all around the world, though. So these dark factories are really interesting because what you're seeing is that there is an enormous investment in robotics and in AI that will allow you to build everything from simple electronics to whole modular homes in an automated basis. And by taking people out of the equation, these factories are able to lower the costs further, not only in labor, but they don't have to pay for heating or cooling. There's also a lot where they've already paid for the robotics, and so they just amortize that across all the units that they're producing. So these robots can work 24/7, 365. Google Jump said, wow, incredible that most American-made cars just bits and pieces from China glued together with faulty American glue. What the hell are you guys over the pond thinking getting into manufacturing if things are this dire? So I actually don't think that's entirely true. When you look at US manufacturing for cars, it's really determined by NAFTA, which is, or USMCA as it's called now. So most of the manufacturing of cars happens between Mexico and Canada and the US. Now, it's true, there are Chinese parts that come in, but these are going to be more chips, wafers, electronics, things that China's already very, very good at. But for the most part, steel, tires, those sorts of things are going to come from a NAFTA country. Best Investing One asked, what high-tech goods does China manufacture 100% in China? The two big things that come to mind is anything around solar and anything around batteries. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is there's been an enormous amount of demand that China itself has created. They need enormous amounts of energy to fund their factories, to fund their population as they have an improving standard of living. But then they also just need it for the AI race. And so you won't find a country that has invested more in solar than China has over the last 10 to 15 years. George Washington, China Emperor, asked, how long would it take for the US to be manufacturing independent from China? If we're just looking at simple assembly, that is maybe a 2 to 3 year thing, because instead of assembling them in China, we can assemble them in Minnesota. The next thing is to move things that maybe require moving some equipment. As long as you have those ecosystem, those suppliers, it's going to take time to build the factory. That's probably going to be about 10 years to go through there. But if we want to be completely independent, meaning that we don't take any raw materials, any ingredients, any sub-assemblies, any expertise from China, you're looking at probably 20 to 30 years. China has shown us the blueprint. It's just a question of, do we want to invest and do those sorts of things, and what are we giving up to invest in those areas versus other areas? Anon 987-654-3210 anonymous asked, so what happened to sweatshops and factory workers in China and poor countries? When people mostly think about China, they think of low-cost labor. And that was true in the early 2000s. But as they've gotten better at making different things, they've moved up market. And so there are things like sweatshops. You tend to find them in other countries, Bangladesh, Vietnam. China installed over 300,000 robots last year. And so while they have an enormous amount of labor that's working on things, the sweatshop, those are long gone for the most part. Nobel Prize 683 asked, why is China aggressively expanding into Africa with the Belt and Road Initiative? So basically what the Belt and Road Initiative is it is a government plan where they said we are going to build infrastructure and trade relationships all around the world. It kind of goes back to the old Silk Road. And what they've done is they have identified ports in markets they're already exporting to or want to export to. They've invested in rail, they've invested in all these other infrastructure. And it's kind of twofold here. The first one is that they need raw materials to feed their manufacturing engine. And so by being closer and by making it easier to extract resources, particularly from South America and from Africa, that helps make sure that China has what China needs in order to export to the rest of the world. The other piece is they are creating a multipolar world. Now they are approaching third world countries, and they're basically saying, hey, we will give you an enormous amount of money to develop your country. So there's a bit of a geopolitical piece. As you've seen this play out over the last 10 to 15 years, as Belt and Road has moved forward, you see the number of countries that recognize Taiwan has decreased dramatically. And that's one of the areas that China is putting pressure on, is they're basically saying, hey, we'd love to give you $20 billion to build a port or an airport over here. Why don't you stop recognizing Taiwan and recognize China instead? And as they're able to put that geopolitical influence on Taiwan, they get closer to that step of hopefully a peaceful reunification from their perspective. A Quora user asked, why is China encouraging even its own citizens' manufacturing businesses to move to other Southeast Asian countries? When you look at the tariffs and where they were pushing manufacturing to, you'd say, oh, we're moving to Vietnam, we're moving to Indonesia, we're moving to Mexico. But the reality is that these are Chinese companies that are first setting up simple assembly in those countries, and then they're training their people. And so it can be a product of Vietnam, but all of the components, sub-assemblies, components are coming from China. There's been a lot of fraud that's gone out there as well, where people are producing something in China, maybe they're sending it to Vietnam, the truck hits a dock and then ships out without anything actually changing. Those loopholes are being found and punished. They talked about moving semiconductor factories to Arizona. One of the things that TSMC was struggling with was the fact that they couldn't find labor. And so they were going to move 1,000 Taiwanese and Chinese trained laborers to Arizona to produce these products. And so, yes, those chips would be made in the United States, but they'd be made by a Taiwanese company with Taiwanese labor just in Arizona. Dino James asked, how has China's economy grown so rapidly since 1980? After you had the Cultural Revolution, you had the Communist Party come in place, there was a lot of collectivization and socialization that happened. It was catastrophic. There was famine and things were very difficult. After Mao died, the next leader, Deng Xiaoping, came to power and he said, look, I'm going to go tour Singapore, Indonesia, these places where there is capitalism, and I'm going to maybe see if we can do different paths. We're going to be very intentional about having some special economic zones where we are going to invite foreign investment. We're going to allow people to make a lot of money. And these are going to be kind of laboratories for capitalism. They said we were going to focus on steel, cement, shipbuilding, rail. And as they invited these Western companies in to set things up, they began to move more and more manufacturing operations into the Chinese mainland. This was a very intentional plan that happened, in the 80s up through the 2000s. And then the biggest thing that opened up the floodgates was China's ascension into the World Trade Organization in 2001, which basically said that we're going to remove all trade restrictions with you virtually, with a promise that you will open up and develop along Western guidelines. Really, the promise was at the time was that China was going to become more like the West. And so starting in the early 2000s, Apple moved all their manufacturing from the US to Taiwan, and then eventually to mainland China because of this. Apple's own internal documents, they show that they invested over $55 billion a year for basically 15 or 20 years, just in terms of the equipment they were installing, the training they were doing, the products that they were sourcing. And so there's an enormous piece here where China grew so rapidly because the West wanted it to. This next question is from the Socialism 101 subreddit. Are working conditions in China really that bad? We don't have the same kind of labor standards that you might see in the West, but this is something that's starting to happen. And it's more being done by people choosing to not do work. In terms of just the overall working conditions, they are getting better, but they are different than what you'd see elsewhere. And so this is why it's still really important when you are looking to source from China, that you ask those sorts of questions, that's important for you and your brand. It's still possible to do things in dirty warehouses with labor that might be questionable. And typically you find that on the smaller end of the supply chain. Big companies like a Lululemon or a Nike, because they get racked through the coals when these things happen in the media, they put a lot of effort into standardizing these sorts of practices with their suppliers. And so the influence of Western large companies in these companies is actually going through and raising the standards for a lot of people. Frequent Plan 5506 asks, does China even have a plan for the aging population crisis, or is the country destined to die out? China has a well-documented demographic shift that's happening. The one-child policy has basically resulted in a lot of aging people and not enough young people to do a one-for-one substitution. And so as a result, they're going to have about 100 million fewer people 20 years from now. The other big thing is that China historically has not been very open or welcoming to mass immigration. And so China has a difficult road ahead. They either need to become much more open and welcoming to taking lots of immigrants and helping to assimilate them from a language and a cultural perspective, or what they seem to be focusing on right now is doubling down into automation. This is everything for today. I hope you learned something. Thank you for watching Chinese Manufacturing Support.